I am Elena, the girl they labeled from nothing. My husband James thought he owned me. He flaunted his London penthouse and tech empire, his voice dripping with pride. Then came that night in Geneva. Before a glittering crowd, he mocked me. Her family's a bunch of nobodies. I didn't flinch. I walked away, my heart pounding with a plan he'd never suspect. The next morning, a jet roared in. My father's lawyers stepped out, men in sharp suits who tore James apart. Everything he bragged about, mine, his empire, built on my family's money, his pride. I smiled as it shattered, crushed by a front-page exposé. Now, I rise from the ruins he tried to bury me in. Step closer. Hear my story, a whirlwind of betrayal, revenge, and the intoxicating triumph of everything I've become. I taste espresso on my tongue even now, recalling that afternoon in Florence when I met James. The cafe hugged the Arno River, its waters glinting gold under the sun. He slid into the chair across from me, his British accent smooth as silk, weaving tales of London penthouses and tech empires. I was Elena, a Tuscan girl with rough hands and quiet dreams, swept up by his charm. His hazel eyes sparkled with ambition, his smile tilted my world. I believed love could span any divide. We married a year later. I followed him to London, trading olive groves for steel and glass. Our penthouse loomed over the Thames, its dark waves restless below. I'd stand by the window at dusk, watching him rev his Porsche. The engine roared through the streets. Once that sound thrilled me. Now it felt distant, foreign. He'd stride in, toss his keys onto the marble counter, and grin. "My Tuscan treasure?" he'd say, his voice warm yet edged with something sharp. I'd smile back, lips tight, sensing a crack in our facade. London pulsed beyond the glass, lights flickering, horns blaring. I felt lost in it. My days blurred into unpacking boxes, arranging shelves, carving a space in his world. I'd close my eyes and hear my mother's rocking chair creaking back home, smell the earth after rain. James never asked about that life. He'd pour wine, boast of new deals, his words drowning mine. Did he even see me? I wondered it often, my fingers brushing the cool glass as he laughed across the room. Was I just his prize, a trophy from a village he'd never visit? The question gnawed at me, unanswered. The Thames rolled on outside, its currents murmuring secrets I couldn't yet grasp. One night, he came home late, his tie loose, his steps uneven. He poured a glass of red, raised it to me, and smirked. "To my little nobody," he said, his tone too casual, too cutting. I froze, wine untouched in my hand. His eyes held something new, a glint I couldn't unsee. Each morning slipped into a quiet rhythm, muted and steady as I left our penthouse behind. London woke slowly beyond the jagged skyline, its edges softened by a pale dawn. I'd weave through its streets to a non-profit on a shadowed lane, my fingers brushing faded coats and cracked spines of donated books. Their simplicity steadied me. James never grasped it. He'd sprawl in our glass-walled living room, legs slung over an armrest, smirking at his phone. "Why bother?" he'd say, his tone slick yet cutting. "You're from some nowhere village. Leave charity to the big names." I'd force a nod, my chest tightening, his words clinging like damp fog. They pierced deeper each time, though I masked it, turning away with a practiced calm. He dubbed me the girl from nothing at dinners with his sleek crowd. The phrase slipped from his lips, casual and cruel, sparking laughter that rang like splintered glass. I'd sit still, tracing the cold edge of my wineglass, until the noise drove me out. I'd retreat to our bedroom, where shadows draped the walls, and open a secret, a tin box, its surface worn smooth, hidden under folded scarves in the dresser. Inside rested my father's letters, their ink faint on brittle pages. I'd salvaged them as a child from my mother's attic after he vanished, clutching them through the years. They murmured of far-off cities, broken vows, echoes of a man I barely knew. James remained blind to them. I kept them close. Time blurred into months. I'd gaze at the city's sprawl, its rooftops flashing under a brittle sun, feeling myself shrink into his world, a silent wife, a polished trinket. He'd stumble in late, cologne thick with cigar smoke. His tales of conquests over rivals spilled out loud and unbroken. I'd perch on an armchair, my voice lost in his flood. Once I spoke of Tuscany's olive trees, their twisted limbs laden with fruit. He laughed. "Quaint," he said, flicking his wrist. The word burned, sharp and sour in my throat. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping the floor, but he didn't notice, already pouring another drink. One rainy afternoon, as water traced silver paths down the windows, I sat with the tin box open on my lap. The letters felt frail, like petals pressed too long. I read my father's words. "You'll find your way, Stellina. Little star." My heart twisted at the ghost of his voice. James burst in then, his briefcase hitting the floor with a thud. "Nailed a deal today," he crowed, missing the box as I snapped it shut. He grabbed the bourbon, poured a splash, its amber glow dancing in the dim light. He raised his glass, eyes glinting with triumph. "To my little shadow," he toasted, his voice low and mocking, slicing through the stillness. I froze, my breath catching. A storm churned inside me, raw and restless, tethered to a promise I could almost taste. The gala in Geneva gleamed like a polished gem, its splendor radiating from a hotel high above Lake Geneva. Chandeliers spilled golden light over the crowd, their chatter mingling with the chime of crystal flutes. I stood beside James, wrapped in a black silk dress he'd picked, its fit too tight, too foreign. He glowed in the spotlight. Tie sharp, grin broad, owning the room with every sweep of his hand. I felt like a shadow, my smile stiff, my fingers laced rigid. Beyond the windows, the lake stretched wide, its surface a still mirror pierced by trembling stars. I watched it quiver, restless beneath the quiet, as James lifted his glass for a toast. His voice rang out, thick with triumph, recounting some grand deal. Then he turned to me, his gaze icy. "Elena's from nothing," he proclaimed, clear and cutting. "Her family, a bunch of nobodies. Lucky she has me to drag her up." Laughter burst forth, a harsh, splintered sound that clawed at the air. My face flushed hot, but I stayed steady, my breath thin. The room spun, faces melting into a smug blur, yet I held my tongue. I whispered an excuse, soft as a sigh, and slipped out. The terrace met me with a brisk wind, its bite sharp against my skin. I stepped to the railing, gripping its cold iron, the lake below a dark oath waiting to be spoken. My hands shook, not with shame, but with a flame igniting inside. His words pounded in my head, each one a stone I'd borne too long. I'd told him about my father once, years ago, over a dim-lit dinner in London. I'd said he'd left when I was young, a fading memory. James had leaned back and laughed. "Your father? A penniless fool," he'd scoffed, flicking his napkin aside. I'd bitten back my words then, but now they roared free, fierce and unbridled. The city twinkled across the water, its lights scattered like fallen gold. I stared at them, my heart racing, the wind pulling strands of hair loose. He thought he'd defined me, a village girl, a canvas for his brush. He was wrong. That laugh in London had planted a spark, and here it blazed, wild and sure. The gala's drone lingered behind me, a hollow buzz of wealth and deceit, but it dimmed as I stood there. I let go of the railing, my hands free at last, fingers curling into fists. I wasn't his nobody, not anymore. The lake gleamed, its depths cloaking secrets I'd soon unravel. James had no inkling of the tempest I'd call down, no hint of the ruin I'd weave. I raised my eyes, the stars above fierce and infinite, and felt it, a threshold crossed, a fury unleashed. This was the night my world turned. The terrace wind sliced through me, raw and biting, as I stood above the lake's dark shimmer, its surface fractured like a broken sword. My hands buzzed from releasing the railing, the cold seeping out, replaced by a steady burn. I slipped my phone from my clutch, its screen flaring bright in the gloom. I dialed Marcus, my father's silent enforcer, a voice I hadn't called in years. "It's time," I said, sharp and sure, the words cutting the night's howl. "Understood," he rasped, and the call dropped. I tucked the phone away, my heartbeat a low thud, solid as stone. The gala's racket spilled out, a brittle clatter of glasses, a chorus of empty praise. I'd bowed to it long enough. I straightened, rolled my shoulders back, and strode inside, the air shifting with me. James didn't see it. He lounged among his pack, champagne tilted in his hand, his laughter crashing like a wave over their gleaming smiles. I approached, my heels striking the marble with crisp, deliberate taps, my expression smooth as glass. He glanced over, his smirk twisting. "Back already?" he drawled, voice thick with scorn. He leaned in, his breath hot and rank against my cheek. "Don't worry, darling, I'll keep you from nothing." The taunt coiled around me, but I didn't blink. I locked eyes with him, my stare cold and unyielding, a spark he couldn't fathom. The room thrummed on, heedless, chandeliers bathing the scene in a honeyed sheen, silk gowns, tailored jackets, a theater ripe for collapse. He was the fool center stage, blind to the curtain falling. The crowd swirled, their chatter a restless current, but my thoughts raced ahead. Beyond the lake's rim, gears churned. Marcus setting the trap, a reckoning James couldn't dream of. I'd let his barbs hollow me out, but that ended now. His sneer from that London night, dismissing my father, had lit the fuse. This last jibe blew it wide open. I stood firm as he turned back to his cronies, clueless to the ground trembling beneath him. The air crackled, taut, like a wire about to snap. I heard it in my bones. The faint growl of a jet, the whisper of documents that would undo him. I reached for a flute from a passing tray, its stem chilled against my fingers, and lifted it in a private vow. The champagne bit my tongue, crisp and electric, as I sipped. The terrace breeze still clung to my skin, a thread of liberty weaving through the room's cloying warmth. James babbled on, his voice a dull hum against the storm swelling in my chest. He saw me as his trinket, a prize to flaunt. He was wrong. My calm was no retreat. It was a weapon forged in quiet, poised to cut. I set the glass down, its clink a signal, my resolve hard as flint. The night unfurled before me, infinite and fierce, and I knew it plain his throne was crumbling and I'd rise from its dust. I jolted awake to the jet's roar slicing through dawn, its sound crashing over Geneva like a wave-breaking rock. Sleep had dodged me all night, my thoughts a restless churn, but now I stood at the hotel window, peering at the lake's steely glint. I dressed fast, tugging on a plain coat, its wool a soft shield, and slipped out before James roused. The airport crouched beyond the city's edge, its runway glossy with dew. I arrived as the plane landed, its silver hull piercing the fog. Marcus stepped out first, his suit sharp, his gaze like chipped stone. The lawyers followed, a quiet legion, folders clasped tight, their strides clipped. He pressed a stack of papers into my hands, their edges keen as a knife. "It's all yours," he said, voice a low rasp. I skimmed the text. Penthouse, firm, cars, all mine, stitched into trusts by my father's invisible threads. Back at the hotel, havoc reigned. I found James in our suite, pacing, his phone clutched tight, his voice a ragged howl. "Frozen? How?" he snapped, then spotted me. He stilled, eyes slitting, but I brushed past, Marcus and the lawyers trailing like a shadow guard. I dropped the papers onto the table, their thud a muted storm. "You said I came from nothing," I told him, my words steady, piercing. "What are you now?" His face contorted, fury clashing with shock as he grabbed the stack. His fingers quaked, pages rustling, his breath a broken gasp. The room tightened, walls closing, the air heavy with his collapse. He yelled, swore, but the lawyers stood firm, their stillness a fortress he couldn't crack. I watched him shatter, shard by shard. His accounts were sealed, his board cast out, his empire crumbling like ash in the wind. He lurched at me, voice splitting. "How?" he roared, but I stepped aside, unshaken. Marcus cut in, his tone hard as granite. "Her father poured $10 million into your startup," he said. "Every cent you flaunted, his." The blow landed, James reeling, his mouth agape. I saw it again. That London night, his sneer at my father's name, a penniless fool, now a boomerang striking him down. The suite's chandelier winked overhead, Its beams splintered across the floor, a crown dashed for a toppled lord. He'd climbed on my family's spine, blind to the roots beneath. I turned to the window, the lake catching the sun's first fire, its ripples alive with light. James's pleas scraped the air, hoarse and frantic, but they slid off me. I'd borne his contempt like a yoke, let it dim me, but no more. A flicker of pity stirred, then faded to cold clarity. The papers sat there, a blueprint of his fall, and I felt the shift, his weight lifting, my strength unfurling. He'd branded me nothing, but I'd seized it all. His world, his lies, his ruin. I moved to the door, my stride sure, the jet's hum pulsing beyond like a heartbeat calling me forward. His voice cracked behind me, a dying echo. As I stepped free, my shoulders light, my power no longer a whisper but a shout ready to ring. The morning flared into a torrent of ruin, James's kingdom toppling under the force of my reckoning. I stood in the suite, the papers strewn across the table, their ink a web that bound him fast. His world dissolved, the penthouse torn from his grasp, his company snatched away, his cars vanishing by midday. He sagged against the wall, shirt creased, his face a shell of rage and despair. I crossed to the desk, the divorce papers crisp and waiting, their lines a guillotine's edge. I signed with a firm stroke, the pen's scrape a knell for his reign. The jet purred outside, its call threading through the glass, beckoning me onward. Marcus scooped up the documents, his nod swift, and I pivoted to go, my coat swirling like a flag of triumph. James lunged, his voice a shredded cry. "Elena, stop!" he gasped, clawing at my sleeve, his grip damp and frantic. "Please, I'll fix it. I'll grovel if I must." I wrenched free, my eyes locked on his, cold as frost. His pleas splintered, a frantic chant. "I'll change, I swear, don't leave me like this." They crashed against me, frail as leaves in a gale, and I stepped forward, unyielding. The lake outside burned gold under the rising sun, its glow a forge remaking me. His empire wasn't just lost, it was mine, reclaimed in full, and he'd never claw it back. I reached the door, his wails thinning to a broken hum, and marched to the airstrip. The jet stood ready, its hull a gleaming spear, a gate to my rebirth. I boarded, the leather cool against my thighs, and peered down as Geneva dwindled. James a faint smear in the rain-drenched haze. He hadn't felt the final sting. Clara, my friend from those endless Tuscan summers, had stood at the gala, her journalist's pen poised behind her quiet smile. She'd caught every barb he flung, every sneer, and now her words blazed across the Times. Tech mogul unmasked as fraud, built on wife's fortune. The story hit London by dawn, his name a jest on every tongue, his pride razed to cinders. He'd smirked at her once, years back in a Florence cafe, dubbing her a scribbler with no spine. Her ink proved sharper than his steel. I imagined the newsstands alight, his disgrace a wildfire he couldn't quench, and felt the last of his shadow peel away, a skin I'd shed. The jet soared, the sky unfurling in a bold, relentless blue, and freedom surged through me, fierce and alive. James's voice lingered, a fading wisp, but I banished it. I'd hauled his disdain too long, let it chain me, but that yoke snapped here. The papers beside me bore my mark, a seal on his grave and my ascent. The engine's thrum sang in my chest, a hymn of flight, and I brushed the window, its chill a spark against my skin. He'd crowned himself lord, me his nothing, but I'd raised his tower to dust. Geneva faded into mist, and I knew this was my sky, boundless and claimed, a dawn I'd forged from his smoldering wreck. I stand on my father's estate in the south of France, the Mediterranean sun drenching the hills, its heat a salve across my shoulders. The breeze carries salt and thyme, a world unshackled from Geneva's icy hold. Months have passed here. I've traced the pulse of this empire, vineyards threading the land like lifelines, ledgers heavy with heritage. I'm gentler now, my edges worn smooth, yet fiercer, my roots clawing into this soil. James flickers and whispers at gala tables he'll never reach, a dim phantom. His name drifts, a warning carved in air, the fool who flew too close to the sun and plunged to ash. I kneel in my garden, the earth deep and loamy, my fingers urging life from seeds. Roses spiraling open, lavender swaying in the wind. It's not just dirt, it's me, rising fresh from the debris he meant to crush me under. I think of him sometimes, not with venom, but a faint sting, like a scar half-healed. His arrogance was his blindfold, and I claimed the light he lost. Marcus dropped the final shard one dusk as the sea flared red beneath a sinking sky. "James crossed your father once," he said, his voice a honed edge. "Monaco, years ago, called him a washed-up nobody, sneered in his face." I laughed low, the irony a bitter spark in my chest. That night in Monaco, James had strutted past the quiet giant who'd unravel him, too drunk on pride to see the strength in those steady eyes. I scatter marigold seeds, their flecks igniting the twilight, and feel the circle close. The estate looms behind me, its stones unyielding, a stronghold I wield. James's tale lingers, a shadow's lesson, hubris digs its own pit. I press a seedling into the ground, the soil cool under my palms, its promise tender yet bold. "From nothing to everything," I whisper, the vow curling into the breeze. He saw me as a void to fill, but I took it all. His fall, my flight, this life blooming through my hands. The sun dips, torching the hills in amber, and I rise, my shadow stretching long and fierce. I'll build on this earth, a legacy he'll never touch, a woman forged by her own fire. And so my story circles back, a woman branded nothing, soaring to seize everything. James's collapse whispers this. Arrogance crafts a brittle crown, shattered by its own echo, while resilience forges empires from scorn. I turned his taunts into the jet that swept me free, his mockery into the soil where I bloom anew. His pride blinded him, my will lit the way. What about you, listener? What sparks flare in your thoughts from this tale? Did you grin as James fell, or ponder the price of hubris? I crave your voice. Spill your reflections, your lessons in the comments below. Let's weave this thread together. For now, I leave you, but not for long. More tales await, stories of rebels who rewrite their stars, of fires stoked in defiance. Join me again soon where the next spark ignites.